Our top story on Newspoint, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has fallen critically ill following the meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. While the cause of his declining health is yet to be identified, Lukashenko's political rival has now pointed a finger at the Kremlin, alleging that the leader has been poisoned. Now, in his tweet, Sepkalo, the opposition leader from Belarus, claimed after Lukashenko's closed-door meeting with Putin that the Belarusian president was urgently transported to Moscow's Central Clinical Hospital. Remember, these are all claims by the opposition leader. As per Sepkalo, Lukashenko still remains under medical care. Now, what else is opposition leader Sepkalo claiming? He is claiming that blood purification procedures were conducted on the Belarusian leader, and that he also tweeted that Lukashenko is in a non-transportable condition and that Belarusian president plane was sent back to Minsk without him. That's what he's claiming, that Lukashenko remains in a non-transportable condition. His plane flew back to Minsk without the leader inside that aircraft. He further claimed that the Kremlin was allegedly involved in poisoning Lukashenko. So that's a big claim there. Whether there is any shred of truth in that, there is no evidence that he is giving about this claim, but he is claiming that Kremlin allegedly is involved in poisoning Lukashenko and that Moscow's orchestrated efforts to save the Belarusian chief were aimed at dispelling these speculations. That's what he's saying. Now, let's take a look at why Lukashenko is not being in a critical condition is crucial for Russia. Why is Mr. Lukashenko strategically crucial for Russia? Now, Lukashenko is Russia's closest ally in the Ukraine war. So that's important to underscore here. This is mostly because of the close relations Lukashenko and Putin have. These are personal relations that they have. That is why he is important for this Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Belarus and Russia's partnership is a strategic one, and it is based on geographic location and cultural links between both countries and their people. So that also is important to note here. Their people, remember, Belarus's border, Belarus in fact borders multiple NATO allied countries like Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. So that is also something to note here. Moscow and Minsk recently signed an agreement to place Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus. Remember, Lukashenko had claimed that the movement of the tactical nukes from Russia to Belarus had already begun. Lukashenko said that the transfer had already begun and Belarusian forces are being trained on how to handle them. Putin has said that the training would be complete by the end of July. Now, Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko has claimed that nations who are willing to join the union state of Russia and Belarus, the union state, quote-unquote union state, they will be given nuclear weapons. So that's another big claim that is coming from Lukashenko. These are what the Russian media reports are saying, that Lukashenko has said that nukes for nations allying with Russia and Belarus. That's what he's claiming, that anyone who joins us of the union state of Russia and Belarus will be given nuclear weapons. His comments on handing out nuclear weapons to allies are likely to heighten concerns over the use of nuclear weapons. Now, Russia and Belarus have good ties. Most of this is because of Lukashenko's pro-Russia stand. The Kremlin does not want a transfer of power or fresh polls in Belarus because Lukashenko, being at the helm of affairs, works in their favor. Let's now cut across to our guests. What does Lukashenko mean for Putin and his strategic importance for Moscow, particularly during this war in Ukraine? We are now being joined by two eminent personalities here. Dr. Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He is joining us from Canberra. And Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, international affairs analyst, author and historian. He is joining us from Brussels. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for speaking to WION.
Thank you for having us.
Dr. Davis, let's begin with you. Let's first talk about the Belarusian opposition leader's claims, that Lukashenko was rushed to the hospital after that closed-door meeting with Vladimir Putin and Kremlin cover-up operation, as he's alleging. Do you see any shred of truth in those claims? Because, Lukashenko was missing after that Victory Day parade. He missed one of the public appearances in Belarus, but later appeared, at least the state media showed, that he is hale and hearty. So do you see any evidence of truth in those claims by the opposition leader, Sipkala?
Look, I think it's impossible to know at this early stage, but if it is true, if Lukashenko is seriously ill and in a hospital, then it does raise some interesting dynamics in terms of the stability in that region, in terms of Russia's options for intervening more deeply inside Belarus, and indeed for the response of the Belarusian people. And also, I'd add the Belarusian military itself. And by the military, I'm talking about the rank and the file, not necessarily the general staff, because the general staff seem to be loyal to Moscow. I'm not sure about the rank and the file. So I think that it does raise some pretty interesting scenarios in terms of what might happen if Lukashenko is basically taken out of the picture by whatever means has occurred. And the other question, of course, as your lead-in suggested, is the presence of Russian tactical nuclear weapons on Belarus. What are the implications of the dynamics in terms of stability between the West and Russia, if indeed that goes ahead, and with the war just to the south in Ukraine raging as Ukraine launches its counteroffensive?
Interesting. Dr. O, let's talk about the strategic importance of Belarus to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or what they call is a special military operation in Ukraine. Now, Belarus shares borders with 3 NATO allies, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. Talk to us about Belarus and Lukashenko, and how Lukashenko in particular is important or strategically, crucial for Putin's plan.
I think you're correct in this last question in putting the emphasis on strategically. In your introductory remarks, you commented on the personal closeness between Lukashenko and Putin. There, I beg to disagree. Personal relations here are the least of the issues before us, because if you go back very briefly in history, you find that over a decade, Lukashenko and Russians have been sparring over economic differences and over the efforts by Belarus to extort from Russia the greatest advantages possible in the trade in hydrocarbons, for example. So it is a strategic commonality of interests that we're talking about here. And the personalities at the top are acting out the roles that you would expect from countries which are obliged to get along very well, whatever their differences may be in secondary matters like making money. The position of Belarus is critically important, not just for this war, but in the overall position and strategic defense of Russia against NATO. For that reason, we have to look at the relationship on state-to-state level, which is not an alliance. It's something much tighter than an alliance. It is, as you said, a union state. And the president of Kazakhstan, at the meeting for which Lukashenko was in Moscow in the closing days of last week, the meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union, Mr. Tokayev called attention to the special relationship, which he called a unique phenomenon, because it is 2 countries under one state. Not 2 peoples under one state, but 2 countries under one state, with common executive, common legislature, and with harmonized economics, culture, and military interests. This is a unique situation. The idea that Mr. Lukashenko was poisoned by the Russians discredits entirely the claims of this opposition leader, who has gotten himself into the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, and the Mirror in the UK with his claims about Mr. Lukashenko's critical condition. It is a very good talking point to get attention of media, but it is not just improbable, but impossible.
All right.
The Russians want is for Mr. Lukashenko to disappear.
Right. But we are basing these. These are the claims that are made by the opposition leader, which is why we are clearly quoting the opposition leader in making those claims. We are not saying that these claims are correct. But Dr. Davis, let's bring you back into this conversation. Dr. Doctorow said that the personal relations between the two leaders don't matter that much in this equation. But you talk to us about that, and also talk to us about this nuclear deployment, the tactical nuclear deployment that we are seeing that Belarus and Russia are claiming. What is the Belarus's game plan here? Let me quote the State Secretary of Belarus's State Security Council, I beg your pardon. He has said that the West left us with no choice but to deploy nuclear arms. So how do you assess this move, and how do you think that West is going to react to this? Because Pentagon is still holding off delivery of F-16s to Ukraine.
Well, I think that the Pentagon or the US government has actually, in all effect, approved the delivery of the F-16s. They're moving forward with training, and I think that training naturally leads to delivery. And I think everyone understands the F-16s are going ahead. I think in terms of how the Russians respond to that, the movement of those tactical nuclear weapons, Iskander missiles onto Belarus, will only accentuate the risks of Russia doing something foolish in terms of escalation. Certainly it will place NATO's eastern frontier, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania in particular, are under more concern in terms of what Russia might do, particularly if it's facing defeat in Ukraine, which I think is highly likely later this year. So I think that what NATO needs to do here is to strengthen its deterrent message to Moscow and be ready to respond to any threat that does emerge in terms of the use of those tactical nuclear weapons. We cannot afford to see nuclear weapons being used in the Ukrainian conflict. In terms of Lukashenko's fate, I think it's up in the air. We don't know what's happened to him. I think that it's very clear that Russia wants Belarus to be ultimately become part of a greater Russia, Novorossiya, just as it does with Ukraine. And if Lukashenko were to be removed from power, it does give a power vacuum that then Moscow could seek to fill. But as I said in my earlier remarks, it would then depend on the Belarusian people and the Belarusian military as to how they would respond to any attempt by Russia to basically annex Belarus.
All right. One final question to you, Dr. Doctorow. Like Dr. Davis was talking about, if Mr. Lukashenko is not at the helm of affairs, what does that mean for this equation and the larger war in Ukraine? Let me also underline, as per the state media of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko has said that I'm not going to die, guys. You will have to struggle with me for a very long time to come. But there's exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who has told her supporters to be ready to grab any chance to turn her country into democracy. How do you think the equation is going to pan out if, and it's a big if Lukashenko is not at the helm of affairs?
Well, there are two issues here. First, it is entirely possible that the story of the opposition has a basis to it. Yes, indeed, Mr. Lukashenko left the May 9th meetings in Moscow early and unexpectedly did not stay for the general dinner. Yes, there were reports that he was ill, and there were reports at the time in Russian media that Lukashenko had already appointed a successor, a woman, I might add. Her name was not given. So this speculation does not fall on empty ground. It falls on fertile ground. It also comes in a context. So that's my second issue. The context is that in the last week or so, the Belarusians and the Russians were saying that Poland is supportive of what could be called an insurrection in Belarus with the purpose of overthrowing Mr. Lukashenko's government. And the notion of power vacuum in Minsk is totally supportive, because of Lukashenko's illness, is totally supportive of that story. The Russians and the Belarusians have been preparing for just that eventuality of a Polish incursion into Belarus, similar to the Ukrainian incursion into the Belgorod Oblast or region of the Russian Federation last week. This was a dress rehearsal for an attack on Belarus. And you can be sure that the Russians and the Belarusian government in Minsk are well prepared for that eventuality, and it will not be promising of a peaceful evolution of the relations with NATO.
All right, Dr. Malcolm Davis and Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, thanks very much for joining us with your perspectives on this story.
Thank you.